Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of resilience, justice, and the human spirit. Today, we bring you a story that begins with an ordinary man, Marcus, who, in the face of injustice, stands firm and transforms a moment of humiliation into a fight for accountability. This is a story about courage, standing up for what's right, and the lessons that change us all. Join us as we dive into today's story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay connected and hear more inspiring life stories. Let's begin today's journey. The sun hung low in the Brooklyn sky, casting a golden glow over the city streets. But the warmth was far from welcoming. The air felt thick, heavy with humidity, as if the entire neighborhood was trapped under a suffocating blanket. It wasn't the kind of day you'd expect something monumental to unfold. But sometimes, life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. Marcus Johnson stepped out of a modest diner nestled in a quiet corner of the neighborhood. He'd just grabbed a quick lunch, nothing fancy. Just a sandwich wrapped neatly in brown paper. But as always, his appearance was immaculate. He wore a navy suit that looked like it had been custom-tailored just for him. Polished shoes reflecting the midday sun. There was something about the way he carried himself that made him stand out. Even in the middle of the hustle and bustle of Brooklyn, he wasn't the type of man to make a scene. But his presence was undeniable. Walking down the street toward his car, Marcus couldn't help but notice the usual chaos around him, vendors shouting to advertise their goods, the honking of taxis, and the constant buzz of voices filling the air. It was the city he knew well, a place that had both hardened him and shaped him. But today, something caught his eye. It wasn't the sound of sirens or the crowd pressing in on all sides, but a figure slumped against the wall outside the diner. An older man, his clothes tattered and face weary, sat with hollow eyes, staring into the distance. He was a veteran, Marcus could tell by the patches on his jacket and the look in his eyes. But unlike the men and women who had once stood tall in the streets of Brooklyn, this man was invisible to everyone else. As people hurried by, oblivious to his presence, Marcus stopped in his tracks. There was a pause, a moment of stillness that felt like it stretched for an eternity. His mind flickered back to the old lessons his father had instilled in him: never forget those who have been forgotten by society. Always offer a hand to those in need. So, without hesitation, Marcus approached the man, reached into his bag, and pulled out the warm meal he had just picked up. "Here you go," Marcus said, his voice calm but genuine. He handed the bag to the man, who looked up in surprise. His eyes softened as he took it, his hand trembling slightly. "Thank you," the veteran murmured, his voice shaky but sincere. "God bless you." Marcus offered a small smile, his heart quietly warming at the interaction. It was a simple gesture, nothing grand or extraordinary, but it mattered to him. He knew, deep down, that the little things in life were what truly shaped us. The warmth of human connection, the ability to see and help others. Even in passing, these were the moments that held true value. With a final nod to the man, Marcus turned and walked back toward his black Jeep Grand Cherokee, parked across the street. Unbeknownst to him, his every move was being watched. Two patrol officers, Officer Thompson and Officer Ramirez, were parked nearby in their cruiser, leaning casually against the vehicle. The moment they saw Marcus, a sneer crossed Thompson's face, a look that had become all too familiar to him. "Look at that," Thompson muttered to Ramirez. "Bet his ride's stolen. Let's have some fun with him." Ramirez chuckled, the eagerness in his eyes reflecting the twisted amusement they both shared. They had seen men like Marcus before, the ones who thought they were untouchable. They assumed their uniforms gave them the right to mess with anyone who didn't fit the mold of what they expected. Today, Marcus would be their target. As Marcus approached his car, his thoughts focused on the day ahead. Unaware of the brewing storm behind him, he opened the door, carefully placing his briefcase inside, ready to get back to work. But before he could close the door, A sharp voice cut through the noise of the street. "Hands where I can see them." Marcus froze. The sound of his name, Marcus Johnson, "Hands up," was not unfamiliar. But it came with a different edge today. Confusion flashed across his face as he turned slowly, looking at the officers, their hands resting on their belts. His mind raced, trying to understand why this was happening. Why these men were confronting him out of nowhere. Is there a problem? "Officers." His voice was steady, his posture calm. But the tension was undeniable. He knew this wasn't right. But he also knew he had to stay in control. "Is this your car?" Thompson's voice was sharp, demanding. His eyes were scanning Marcus, as if looking for any sign of resistance. Marcus took a deep breath, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the hostility in the officers' voices. "Yes. It's my car. My registration and license are in the glove compartment," he said, his voice even. But before he could finish his sentence, Thompson grabbed his arm roughly, pulling him back from the door. "Don't move," he barked. "We'll check for ourselves." The world seemed to slow around Marcus as he stood there, his body stiffening with every movement the officers made. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, could hear the murmurs rising as more people began to gather, pulling out their phones. The officers, however, didn't care. They were enjoying the scene. Thompson and Ramirez began to toss things from Marcus's car, papers, sunglasses, and even his neatly folded work gloves, onto the pavement. The crowd reacted with a growing sense of disbelief. "Yo, that's foul," a young teenager whispered, his phone steady as he filmed the entire ordeal. Marcus stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. Anger surged through him like a wildfire. But he fought to keep it in check. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Not with so many eyes watching. Not when every second was being captured for the world to see. "Officers, you're violating my rights." Marcus spoke out, his voice firm but calm. "I haven't done anything wrong." Thompson's smirk deepened, and he stepped forward, his eyes cold. "Shut it. You people think you're untouchable." The words hit Marcus like a slap. "You people." The phrase, dripping with venom, echoed in his ears. He felt the sting of it. But he didn't react, not yet. His anger was building. But he knew it wasn't the time for outbursts. Then, without warning, Thompson swung his baton and smashed the taillight of Marcus's car. The glass shattered, scattering across the pavement. And the crowd gasped, murmurs turning into shouts of disbelief. Ramirez grinned, stepping forward with a crowbar. And with a loud thud, he dented the hood of Marcus's Jeep. "Stop it." He didn't do anything, someone yelled from the crowd. But the officers ignored them, laughing as they continued their destruction. Marcus stood motionless, the fire inside him burning hotter with every second. His mind was racing, calculating every move, every word. He knew this wasn't just an abuse of power. This was a performance, a deliberate act of humiliation. And the officers were putting on a show. The crowd could see it, too. They weren't just watching, they were recording, narrating, and sharing this moment with the world. As the damage to his car mounted, Marcus realized something profound. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small. Every person who had been silenced by those in power. And this moment, would be the spark that lit the fire of change. But Marcus wasn't ready to strike yet. He was waiting for the right moment, waiting for his chance to change the course of this story. The chaos around Marcus was escalating. The officers seemed to take pleasure in their actions, as though they were feeding off the tension in the air. The crowd had grown larger, their phones raised high, capturing every moment. The sound of tires screeching and distant voices shouting echoed in the streets. But to Marcus, it was as if everything had fallen into a slow-motion haze. As the officers continued to destroy his car, Marcus stood there, fighting the urge to lash out. He knew that reacting impulsively could make everything worse. He had to stay composed, he had to remain focused. It wasn't just his car that was being trashed, it was his dignity, his identity, and that of every person who had ever been wronged by the system. But Marcus knew something that the officers didn't: change rarely comes from anger alone. "Stop it," a voice called out from the crowd. But it was drowned out by the noise of the officers' actions. Thompson finally stepped back. His face flushed with a mix of adrenaline and smug satisfaction. "That's what happens when you get too big for your britches. Man. You think you're better than us," he taunted, his voice dripping with condescension. Marcus, still silent, didn't flinch. His jaw was clenched, his body rigid with tension. He felt as though a storm was brewing inside him. But he kept it contained. For now. But in that moment, as the officers stood there, smugly admiring their destruction, Marcus made a choice. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He wasn't going to allow this to be the end of the story. It would be a turning point. A chance to show the world that no one, no matter how much power they held, could break him. With quiet determination, Marcus reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't have to say a word. He simply began to record. The lens of his camera capturing the aftermath of the officer's brutality. Every shattered piece of glass. Every dent. And every scrape on his car. The crowd fell silent, their eyes on Marcus as he began to record. It was as if they were holding their breath, watching for his next move. The officers, too, seemed to notice the shift in energy. Thompson sneered. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes now. "You think you can get away with this?" Thompson sneered, stepping forward with a threatening motion. Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to get away with anything. But I'm going to make sure the world sees what you've done," he replied, his voice calm but laced with steel. For a moment, no one moved. Thompson stared at Marcus, and Ramirez shifted uneasily on his feet. It was clear the officers hadn't expected Marcus to stand his ground like this. They thought they could intimidate him, force him into submission. But Marcus wasn't backing down. Then, a new voice broke through the tension. "Hey! Leave him alone." It was the old veteran, the same man Marcus had shared a meal with just moments earlier. He had risen to his feet, supported by a cane that seemed to shake with every movement. His face was etched with years of hardship, but his eyes were burning with a quiet fire. "Yeah, leave him alone," another voice joined in from the crowd. A teenager, holding up his phone, his finger pointing directly at the officers. "We saw everything. You're not getting away with this." It was like a dam breaking. One voice became two, then three, and soon, the entire crowd was rallying behind Marcus. The officers were no longer in control of the narrative. The power dynamic had shifted. And Marcus, though still composed, could feel a growing sense of hope in the air. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was the fight of anyone who had ever been oppressed, silenced, or dismissed. It was the fight of every person who had ever been made to feel less than. Thompson's eyes darted nervously around the crowd. He had clearly underestimated the power of the people. The officers, realizing the situation was spiraling out of their control, exchanged an anxious glance. Ramirez, who had been smirking earlier, now looked genuinely uncertain. "What's the problem?" "Officer," someone shouted from the crowd. "Why are you harassing this man?" The question echoed through the air like a ripple on a still lake. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge. A challenge to the officers, to the system, to everything that had allowed this injustice to continue unchecked. Thompson took a step back, his fingers twitching nervously as he glanced at his partner. It was clear now that they were no longer the authority in the situation. And it was clear, too, that Marcus wasn't going to let this go. "Let him go," a woman in the crowd said, her voice calm but firm. She was older, her face lined with experience, and her eyes held a wisdom that cut through the tension. "You've done enough damage." For the first time, Thompson hesitated. His bravado was slipping away, replaced by a growing awareness of just how much had shifted. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were participating. They were witnessing something important, something that could change the trajectory of the situation. And then, as though the weight of it all finally hit him, Ramirez took a step back. "Let's go," he muttered to Thompson, his voice filled with reluctance. "It's not worth it." The officers exchanged one last look before they turned and, with an air of defeat, walked back to their cruiser. The tension in the air didn't immediately dissipate, but the crowd had already begun to move. Some people clapped. Others cheered. But there was a collective sense of relief that settled over the scene. Marcus, still holding his phone, watched them leave. He didn't feel victorious, not yet. But something in him shifted. He had stood his ground. And the world had seen it. As the officers retreated, Marcus felt a quiet sense of justice settling over him. The crowd slowly dispersed, their murmurs of approval still echoing in the streets. But for Marcus, the real victory was in the lesson learned that power doesn't always lie in control, but in the courage to stand firm when everything seems stacked against you. As he watched the last of the onlookers leave, his phone buzzed with messages of support, his story already spreading far and wide. For him, it wasn't just about the destruction of his car, it was about making a statement. About showing the world that accountability mattered. He wasn't just another man in the crowd. He was someone who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. The fight wasn't over. But for today, Marcus had taken a step toward real change. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful life stories that inspire change.